So the next panel is going to be led by Dean Sir, who is with the Metachromatic Leukodystrophy Foundation. And we at NINDS kind of picked this topic. It's a general discussion of one voice or many to advance a disease mission. And so what are the advantages and disadvantages if there are several patient and advocacy groups interested in a particular disease? Do you do better if you band together, which can be politically complicated, or do you do better if each one of you is working independently to influence public opinion and funding? Dean.
And so at the end of this, we'll have the answer, right? So I know we're not going to have any slides. I don't know how to turn that down. We're not going to have any slides. It's just going to be a discussion. And we sit between you and lunch at a little afternoon, and I guess 1 o'clock we're going to go all 12:15. And at 1 o'clock we all have to go order our new iPhones. So we got a lot to do this afternoon. No, this topic is actually very, very interesting, and I'm going to give a couple of words just of introduction and kind of prime the pump a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it over to the panelists, and we're going to talk a little bit, and we want to encourage all of you to talk. Unlike some of the other sessions this morning, part of our audience here is the government and the divisional representatives that are in attendance, because I tend to hear kind of the default is, well, if we could all get along, then we would be so much more productive, and hence we could help everybody else be so productive. But there's a lot of reasons that organizations exist, and even today, as you've heard questions, you've heard people from different organizations in the same disease space, and of course there are thousands of diseases and tens of thousands of organizations out there. So one caution that I need to just throw out there that we wanted to all make clear is that as we give examples of organizations, it's only for example purposes. We're not trying to throw anybody under the bus. We're just trying to allow you to understand some of the observations that we have. Our roots as organizations are very, very different. Some organizations are young, some are old, some are founded, actually many are founded by the passion typically of a parent or a relative or a close friend of somebody that was affected by a rare disease, again, be that months or years or decades ago. And those passions drive the emphasis and the skill set that an organization has. And organizations over time, sometimes they change, sometimes they bring people in, executive directors that can help them be more business-like. Sometimes it's still those same founders of that organization that are running it. MLD Foundation, my wife and I founded it 11 years ago, and we still are the primary drivers of that organization. We're doing distinctly different things than we were a long time ago, but or additively different things than we were a long time ago. But we have to be very sensitive to that. Our missions as organizations focused on the families, compassion, connecting families, education and awareness for the general public. Are we out spending our time raising money so that we can fund maybe compassion projects, or typically it's funding research? A lot of organizations are very focused on raising money and not so much focused on how all that money is spent or dealing with families. Political advocacy. Policy, awareness, down on the Hill, and those sorts of things. Political advocacy is another emphasis of some organizations exclusively, and it's a part of the work that we all are likely doing at some point. And then the elephants in the room. What about this whole thing of the finances and how our organizations get our money in? Who are our donors? And if we all got along, would I have to share my donors? Would I have to share my patient list? Would my annual report say that I didn't accomplish this, but all of us accomplished this? And what does that mean to our ability to raise money? And on one hand, and Story just kind of chuckled a little bit, on one hand, it sounds kind of foolish, because what are we trying to do? We're trying to put all of us out of business, right? We want cures/effective therapies for all these diseases, and so we can all go sit on beaches or whatever your end goal is. But the reality is we've got a lot of work to do in the meantime, and that means we have to have budget for next year, and we have to have donors, and we have to tell them about the good things that we're doing. And if we're not I as an individual am not doing that, but we as a collective organization, what happens if the money doesn't come my way? Those are real issues that are elephants in the room. Another word we don't like to use, but again, you've got to put your business hat on a little bit, and that is the idea of competition. Are we in competition with each other? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Is it a friendly competition? Are we encouraging each other? Or are we marching in parallel? And where are we overlapping? Are we doing a good job of working together? So we want to talk about some of those things today, and I'm going to turn over to each of the panelists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves and tell a little bit about their perspective. As I say, none of us are government employees. I'm an electrical engineer. We have a lawyer. We have a doctor. We have concerned parents and families with experiences, new organizations, long-term organizations, and so on. And so you're going to see a little bit of difference up here. As I mentioned, my wife and I founded the MLD Foundation 11 years ago. We started off with almost exclusively a compassion focus on families, rare disease, trying to get families together to be able to support and help each other, because we had no therapies. Fast forward a decade, and we've got research underway in 2 clinical trials and 2 more hopefully coming next year. And we've been actively involved, not taking away from the families, but adding to what we do, raising money, determining where we want to spend that money for research, and becoming much more aggressive in policy areas and in some of these sorts of forums. I've developed a personal passion for helping other people, or at least encouraging them along the path. So our perspective is as a small organization with some time history that has changed over time. And I guess, I don't care which, why don't we start with Sharon on the far end, and we'll work back this way. And if you just share us a little bit about your history, and then we'll talk a little bit.
Yes, because I wasn't on the coordinating phone call, I get picked to go first. So I'm Sharon Hesterly. I split my time as a scientific director of the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration and also for Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, which is focused on Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I've been doing that for about a year, and before that I was with the Parent Project exclusively, and before that I was with the Muscular Dystrophy Association for about 10 years, where I headed up their translational research program. So I've had a lot of experience in different organizations, and interestingly, experience with 2 different organizations in the same research space. And what I can say absolutely is that a big organization like MDA and a smaller single disease-focused organization like Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy really fill different niches. There is not a lot of overlap in the activities of these groups, but occasionally there is, and occasionally there are clashes. But there is an ecosystem out there and a lot of roles to fill. And one of the things that when I was at MDA, I'd like to remind them about is that it's not always a zero-sum game when it comes to donors. That a lot of times when you have additional disease organizations come into your space, they're not taking your donors. They're bringing a whole new, cadre of people out there with them. So it can be additional dollars to the bottom line across, the disease. So that's something to think about. Then my third point that I'll just say briefly is, in my experience, there are projects that organizations can collaborate around easily and projects that are difficult. So what I've seen is things like infrastructure, building tools, building registries, biorepositories, things that NIH would prefer to fund on a project-specific basis, but they actually tend to do better if they have a sort of guaranteed funding stream. These aren't sexy projects, really. They're often hard to explain to donors, and the ownership issue doesn't seem to be as critical. It seems to be that people are willing to collaborate around infrastructure projects much more easily. On the other hand, something like a very high-profile clinical trial or research project, everybody wants the credit for that. Those, I think, are harder collaborations. That's just in my experience. So when we have the opportunity, to do a collaboration, we like to do it around these sorts of resources, because they're expensive, for one thing. They're hard to maintain, hard to keep funded, so pulling your resources is good. And the donors don't seem to pay as much attention to that. Whereas I think it's a harder sell to say we're going to, split the credit 10 ways for a high-profile research project. So, and you may have other experiences or disagree, and hopefully that's what we're going to hear about in this discussion.
Thank you. My name is Eileen Miller, and I'm here sort of in a couple different capacities. I'm the mom of a son who has a hypothalamic hamartoma, which, for those of you that don't know, it's a rare brain tumor that also causes epilepsy as well as a lot of endocrinological complications. I'm here as a representative of a foundation that I'm one of 3 co-founders of called Hope for Hypothalamic Hamartoma. And as shared earlier, we're at the other end of the spectrum. We are exclusively volunteer. We are founded by 3 parents. We all have day jobs. We're doing this with a lot of passion and compassion and time above and beyond our day jobs, really in support of our family members. And we are one of those foundations where we started because we wanted to make sure that patients didn't have the same experience that each of us had in trying to find bona fide information about this condition and where to get help, but we would like to ultimately move into research. I'm also here as a part of the epilepsy community, and I see a lot of friendly faces from that community here as well. And I consider myself also a part of the neurology community, of the brain tumor community, and the endocrine community. And historically, I served as the executive director of a cancer foundation. And so the 2 points that I really wanted to make today, one was drawing from the cancer experience, and I think this has been alluded to. One of the things that I observed as the second executive director of a very small lymphoma cancer organization was that there were many projects that we wanted to do and have control over and get credit for exclusively for ourselves. But federal funding for the blood cancers only came to fruition when all of the cancer organizations working in the blood cancers, including lymphoma, leukemia, and multiple myeloma, came together. And it was incredible how we put ourselves in the course of a couple of years on the map. We had historically been an underfunded cancer, competing against, and with all these other cancers to try to raise the bar. And when we put our efforts together, we were able to raise awareness of those blood cancers and federal funding for the cancers. So I would make an appeal to you, since we're all here because of our common bond around neurology, that if there are ways that we can work together, we can raise federal funding for neurological disorders that will benefit all of our organizations. That's number one. Number two, really is just by a show of hands to prove how many commonalities we have among us. How many of you represent disorders that you would say requires a research-based neurologist or a really thoughtful neurologist? Okay, vast majority. How many of you have a condition that requires multidisciplinary care or multi-specialty care? Okay, again, another commonality among us. How many of you would say that your neurological condition also impacts on either a child or adult's social, educational, behavioral, emotional development? Okay, so as you can see, there's probably more that bonds us together than there is that, distinguishes us. And so to just speak about the HH cause for a moment, I am very frustrated in finding neurologists for my son and finding neurologists that will work in a multidisciplinary setting. And for a condition that impacts, some say 1 in a million and some say 1 in 200,000, the likelihood of a research entity creating, a neurological clinic that involves multidisciplinary specialists is unlikely. But if we were to align either with other rare epilepsies or we were to align with other neurological conditions that had those same needs, suddenly the hospitals can justify having a clinic that's focused on bringing those multidisciplinary specialists together. I think the same is true for the registries. We are desperate for a registry, but to recreate, the work that's being done by others, we just don't have the manpower or the financial power to do that. And so if there's a way for us to piggyback or to partner or to get that done in a way that would be meaningful to our community, but in collaboration with other groups, that's something that I think would be very meaningful. So, thank you.
I'm Amy Rick. I'm the CEO of the Parkinson's Action Network, and for the purpose of this conversation, it's relevant that I'm on the board of directors of the American Brain Coalition, which is it's an evolving organization attempting to bring together brain disease organizations on policy issues, and I can talk about that a little bit. I think I'm on the panel as representative of what happens when you do try to unite and speak with one voice, and what are the pros and cons of what we've done, and I'll explain that. PAN is an organization here in Washington, D.C. that represents all of the entire Parkinson's community, the national organizations, local organizations, patients, researchers, caregivers on Parkinson's disease issues. years ago, I've been the CEO for 9 years, but before my time, a decision was made after a couple of years of fighting to to attempt as a community to actually speak with one voice, only on policy issues, on nothing else. With the simple example, I know you all get it. If you go on Capitol Hill, if you're advocating for a particular issue and you have 3 organizations and they each say a very similar thing as you guys, but they say it slightly differently, the easiest thing for a busy person to do is dismiss you because you can't quite agree on what you want. So the theory behind PAN was, can we put our differences aside just for policy and come together as one organization? In the years that I've been at PAN, I think in some levels we have achieved that. The CEOs of 4 of the large national Parkinson's organizations serve on our board of directors, and they provide a third of our funding. So it does all. I will talk more about money in a minute. Also, in recent years, we have tried very hard to involve some of the Parkinsonism diseases that are related to Parkinson's, but not classic Parkinson's. I know many are in the room: progressive supranuclear palsy, multiple system atrophy, and Lewy body with dementia. I will say, for the purposes of this conversation, we do have to constantly reevaluate our structure. I think our community has come to the realization, and actually did that a while ago, that it is better to speak with a unified voice. But there's still a little bit of, it's being taped, isn't it? So I won't say, I am going to say kicking and screaming, but there's some angst that comes with it sometimes, and I'm being honest about that. It means that organizations sometimes, on a particular year, last year from a policy perspective, FDA issues were very significant because FDA was going basically through its reauthorization process. And to the organizations or community that support us, when we're thinking about the fact that we barely have anything in the pipeline, why is PAN working so much on FDA issues when we really need discoveries, it might be a hard swallow for our funding organizations to accept that that's what we're working on. And I think a point I failed to mention when I was describing our structure, PAN is not a coalition of the four national Parkinson's organizations, meaning they don't run us. Those 4 national organizations get 1 vote on our board of directors, just like some of our grassroots representatives do. We have a board of directors of 15 people, and each of them has an equal say on what policy issues we will pursue. So for the Michael J. Fox Foundation, which is a huge research foundation, well over $60 million a year in research, they don't have a Washington office, and they accept the decisions of the organization about what are important policy issues. Now, I'd like to believe we do a good job and we coordinate and we talk so that they understand why we're working on what we're working on. I would say, for the purpose of this conversation, though, that one of the theories that can be sometimes difficult, but I think overall should always win, that helps PAN succeed with this model, is on occasion you have to differentiate between what is good for the community and what might be good for my organization, to help my organization to survive. And I hope I don't sound like a Pollyanna sitting up here when I'd say, if you force yourself with that question to always pursue what's good for the community, I think you might have a rotten day at work, but ultimately it does come around to serving the community better with donors and with funders. That said, I think listening to all of you and knowing who's in the room, there is a real, and getting out of the policy arena, there is a real natural tension too, though, between the need that families in particular have, particularly with a rare disease, to have a home where they found like families. So I'm not sitting here advocating that everyone merge to one huge organization because you'll be more powerful, because you certainly risk losing that home. So there's a very, very real natural tension. But to the extent that organizations can work together on the issues where you don't want to keep reinventing the wheel, policy issues, some gaps analysis issues in your community. If you can come together once a year with your related organizations, who's doing what? Let's not talk about competition. Can we have this meeting be about who's not doing? There's something that needs to be done and nobody's doing it. Can we at least talk about that? I think Well, I guess that's it. The only other thing I'd want to say is, as I said, I do serve on the board of the American Brain Coalition, which is also supposed to be policy related, and the theory behind that organization, which a few of you are members, many, I suspect more of you have never even heard of it. The theory behind that organization is to bring just on policy issues. The big organizations, American Academy of Neurology, Society for Neuroscience, are large contributors to that organization, and organizations that have a budget of $100,000, you're all welcome, and could we come together and benefit from policy? Because policy work is very hard for a small organization to support. It's very expensive to keep someone monitoring what's going on in Washington. It's been a wake-up call for me that it's harder to get ABC going than we would have thought. It's such a great idea, right? And the big organizations are paying the bulk of the funding, so what could be so difficult about this? But in fact, to really succeed, we don't want to just educate the smaller organizations about going on in Washington, but actually harness their energy to advocate on the particular issues. And then what happens is, well, what are the issues that they're going to advocate on? Is it the issues SFN is working on? Society for Neuroscience? Is it the issues PAN is working on? So I'm afraid I'm not being a very good marketer for having you join ABC, but I am a firm believer it is the right way to go. So I would encourage any of you who are interested to talk to me about what ABC might do, but anything you all can do to partner together so that we're not wasting these precious donor resources, which is what we're talking about. And last thought, as we do have our conversations, PAN is not an idealistic structure. When we do have problems, it's always around fundraising, always. Even if the said topic of the meeting is about something else, when you really get to the heart of what caused the problem, here is money was involved. And it can get very, very difficult. And I think to do justice to this session, we'll probably need to talk about that.
Well, thank you. So it's a little bit easier to talk about those places where we can work together. You know, as you say, maybe a little idealistic, but we can slowly align around policy and these general sorts of things. I want to probe for a few minutes and come back to this. Where is it okay not to work together? Now, maybe that's way too extreme, but where are our individual identities really important? With the MLD Foundation, I'd like to say I was a really smart guy, but I think I was a lucky guy in retrospect, in that we didn't care about money when we got started. And so we made friends with everybody. We made friends with other organizations in our space. We, of course, made friends with families. And frankly, the researchers, the government agencies, they all opened up to us because nobody was threatened. Now, some of them backed away a little bit when they realized we didn't have a big checkbook and so on, but we still nurtured those relationships. When we started to have money, those people still trusted us. And in fact, other organizations in our specific disease space, a couple of them that do nothing but raise money, now call us to ask where should those checks be written. And because we know the researchers, and we're kind of non-biased with most of those researchers. So we got a little bit lucky in that space. I'm not sure that that's the typical path, but I'd like to probe this just a little bit. We mentioned, I think actually, Amy, you mentioned both of these. One was money. The second was the sense of community that you might lose if you all come together and you kind of get this neutral, lukewarm maybe. If it's not hot or cold, if we're all extremely different, we kind of find that common ground. But maybe if you all can comment on places where identity is important, where it's not that you're not working together, but you are maintaining the identity and maybe the history and the roots and the strategic direction of your organizations. We don't have to go in any order, so we didn't rehearse this.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets back to the question of why a lot of organizations, especially bigger organizations, actually have chapter structures. And it's because when you have a smaller group that's local, you have those local community connections. And I think you see the same thing with, disease areas where you may have big and small groups, that a lot of times the small groups just have a different constituency. They have local connections. They have more direct connections. A larger organization may be focused more on broader topics that are less specific. So, I mean, I think that's one example of a place. There's always a need for it. You're always going to have a greater impact with people that are in your either your immediate geographic area or, with fundraising, or who are more closely related. So one example, which is pretty extreme, is in the Duchenne area, there's over 40 different organizations raising money for a disease that probably affects 15,000 people in the United States. So that seems like a lot of overkill, and you can even further subdivide that. Now that there are drugs that are focused on specific mutations, we have a division of even further of parents dividing up into camps, and they even put their son's mutation on their card so that they can self-segregate at meetings. And that can be a little bit extreme, I think. Maybe not the best example, but the different groups actually do have sort of different constituencies to some extent. Some are more interested in putting money into exon skipping. Some people who have, whose kids have duplications say, this isn't really going to help my son. I want to fund something different. So I think there are reasons from strategy standpoint that people self-segregate into these different groups, even within a disease area. So.
Yes, speaking from personal experience, I think that Hope for Hypothalamic Hamartoma came about because no one was addressing these specific issues, and I think that we're uniquely poised to provide information and support to people, to patients, newly diagnosed with this, to caregivers taking care of them, and to the researchers that are interested in this area. That being said, we often collaborate with organizations like Epilepsy Therapy Project, Epilepsy Foundation, Cure, and others because we don't need to do it all. When it comes to your educational rights, when it comes to your workplace rights, when it comes to other types of support groups, there's no reason for us to use the resources to create. And frankly, because our patients are internationally dispersed and they're in such small numbers, it wouldn't make for a very satisfying experience if we were running support groups, so to speak, in locations around the country. There would not be a lot of people in those. It's better for us to align with organizations that already exist for those types of resources. But I absolutely feel like, that being said, there is a role for our organization and the individualized support that we can provide for people with this condition, informationally and otherwise.
I agree with what's been said, and the only thing that I would add, again, is to focus very much when you start an initiative or working on something, are you filling a need for the community that no one else is filling? And if the answer is yes, then you should pursue it. The harder, I think most people get that question, and it's not that complicated. The flip of that, though, can be if you've been doing something for a while and you love what you do and you feel good about what you do, but another organization is starting to do the same thing better. It's really hard, but sometimes you have to shut down your program and be willing to do that. And it can be painful to do that. And those can be tough discussions. But I completely agree with what you said, Dean, is the credibility you gain within your community for proving that you're focused on what the needs of the community are versus my organization, even if that used to be a really good fundraising program for me, that you're focused on the needs for the organization will ultimately be very healthy for your organization and for the community.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The issue of community and what's good for that community, there are several different aspects that we brought up, and I think with about 5 minutes left here, what I'd like to do, instead of going back and rediscussing maybe advocacy and some of the education and awareness, which seem to be areas that at least we can take small baby steps towards working together on, I'd like to turn it over to questions or comments from the audience and use our time that way. If somebody could run the mic up, or if you could stand to the mic, that would help for the videotape.
My name is Taylor Scott. I'm with Nevis Outreach. We advocate for melanocytic giant nevi. And while I'm young and idealistic, I love the idea of an overarching, unified interstrata, I suppose, like patient registry. That'd be great. But I hear kind of two paths of problems. One would be in the non-ideal world, getting your sample size for it to really be viable, and I guess that's why we really need everyone to join on. But the other question I had was ethics. If you're joining a bunch of these communities who have really entrusted your organization with their patient registry data and their medical data, are there ethical boundaries that could be crossed by sharing it with multiple other organizations? And if so, what measures have been taken to minimize that risk?
Well, I think you always have to be honest, obviously, with anyone in your database about how you're going to use the data. And I will say that you mentioned, fundraising and sharing your database are the two real sensitive points. But there's practical ways of getting around it. If you are trying to reach communities and you're giving information out, it just has to go through you. We send information from other organizations out all the time. We just take it and then we forward it to our database. That may be just a simple solution, but that's, I think, a pretty common way of trying to get around that.
I think there's a line that's also drawn between the IRB controlled, regulated research registry versus the registry that most foundations operate, which tends to be more of a profile or a contact database. You're always bound by ethics, and I think you always have to be transparent with those that contribute the data. But as advocacy organizations, we're not bound by all those IRB rules. We're still bound by the ethics. You maybe should behave those ways. You should have a scientific review board and all those kinds of things if you deem that appropriate. But my experience in the rare disease space is that we as parents, as spouses or relatives, we're willing to take more risk in the research. We're willing to be more vulnerable with our data, because if I don't give my data, there's nobody else that's going to give it. Right? There's just not those big sample sizes. Now, sometimes you have to work with people to do that, but that we're in a slightly different space there as well. But maybe that's something, you're as you say, you're young and enthusiastic. If you can get across this space while you're young and enthusiastic and say, this is what I'd like to do with the other 3 or 4, or the umbrella organizations, or the organizations, it could be that umbrella, that you might be the spark that causes all of the old fogies to say, oh, no, that makes sense. How can we work this out together?
Okay, so I've just learned a very important issue. We should have had each of these panels for an hour, not a half an hour. We have time for one more question, Paul, and then what we're going to do is people who are going to get their lunch next door will do that. People who are going to the cafeteria will do that, and we have to be back here as a courtesy to the speakers in the next session in half an hour. So, Paul, if you want your question.
Sure, I'll see if we can do it. I think it was Bob Finkelstein who said you should try to find common themes on the research front. There's been a lot of discussion about the sort of challenges in the fundraising and the advocacy policy types of things. Can you talk about, and it might be a better question for staff, but things that you've seen that are areas where you've had maybe with diverse groups? I know you've got lots of organizations in one disease area, but where you've had diverse groups partner to look for a common theme, so that you're then coming and saying, wow, we think there's this area that maybe there should be a program announcement about, it would serve, and already seeing the look from Story. So
I'm sorry.
Anyway,
sorry, never could play poker.
You're invited. So do you have any examples where you've gotten the groups together to sort of say, what's an important theme, and that's gone well?
Okay. Well, actually, I have an example of that as well. On the other side, I'm also with the frontotemporal degeneration group, and there's a great example. There was just a gene mutation discovered last year that probably explains the majority of the inherited forms of both frontotemporal degeneration and ALS. And so there's, a lot of ground for collaborations there around science. 2 very different types of diseases, but with a common cause.
Can you just say a little bit about what was done to get that common theme?
Right. Well, so the common theme exists because we know that it's found in both disorders. But moving forward, for example, we are co-funding a satellite symposium at the Society for Neuroscience meeting with the ALS Association. So FTD and ALS are coming together to do that. We've also had some preliminary talks about doing some joint grant funding mechanisms as well to try and pull that together. So, and then on the other hand, of course, there's a lot of overlap with frontotemporal degeneration and Alzheimer's. So we also work with the ADDF, and we have a joint funding mechanism. So again, very different diseases, but they're collaborations around the science. So it can be done. Yeah. It's easier because you're not fighting over donors.
Right. As an organization, we're talking about strategically what do we do in 2013, and we've always invited other organizations to our family meetings and our conferences, and so we've been somewhat transparent with that intentionally, so that the information is shared and so no one's threatened. But as we go forward, one of the things that we're intentionally going to do is bring together not only researchers to figure out what's next and what those themes are, because we don't know, we kind of know, but we need everybody on the same page. But But we're bringing other organizations into that discussion as well, because it's not my disease, it's everybody's disease. But thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Lesson learned for next time. Very interesting topics, and we shouldn't try to crunch two of them together.